When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful, and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, What is that to us? You see to it. Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple, and departed, and went and hanged himself. But the chief priests took the silver pieces, and said, It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, because they are the price of blood. And they consulted together, and bought with them the potter's field, to bury strangers in. Therefore the field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. My name's Arthur. Thank you for joining me as we share together the beginning of Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 to 10. Jesus' public ministry had lasted 3 years. He had served the people, but not through the establishment. Very early he attracted the attention of the Pharisees, the scribes, the chief priests, because he was teaching the people, but he had never been to their schools and learned their ways. His teaching was fresh and different and extraordinary. It made the authorities uncomfortable because it challenged their position. And when they couldn't find any fault with him, they concluded that Jesus must go, because otherwise their comfortable arrangement with the Romans would fail. But every attempt to find a fault with Jesus failed, until Judas came along and offered to betray Jesus to them at a time when the crowd was not around, because the authorities feared the crowd, who respected Jesus as a prophet. For just 30 pieces of silver they could have what they wanted. Jesus had been betrayed by Judas, who had led a large group of soldiers and people from the chief priest's household to where Jesus was spending the night, as he often did, in the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. Jesus had not fought back or resisted. He allowed himself to be taken. He instructed Peter to put away his sword and not defend him on that occasion. Peter followed at a distance and saw what happened to Jesus. He was taken ultimately to Caiaphas' house and then stood before the Sanhedrin, an extraordinary meeting of the Sanhedrin in the very early hours of the morning, where they sought false testimony, and not finding any evidence of anything that Jesus had done wrong, challenged him, Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God? And when Jesus affirmed he was, rather than taking evidence to justify the claim, they immediately pronounced he was a blasphemer, and the penalty under Moses' law for blasphemy is death. The problem is that blasphemy is a very convenient charge to convict an innocent person on. The principle is the same as that used today to silence dissidents of a regime, claiming that they are against the state when they make statements that the state does not approve of. So on that charge, they convicted Jesus to death. But how were they going to carry that out? A traditional way would have been stoning. But these people were scrupulous to do things legally, even though they'd broken the law already in several ways. They wanted to be seen to be doing things legally. They were subject to the Romans, who had taken away the right of the Sanhedrin to impose the death penalty. And so they plotted, and they came up with the scheme of getting the Romans to execute Jesus on the charge that he was a king, that he proclaimed himself the King of the Jews, therefore he was in rebellion to Caesar, therefore he should be executed as a traitor to Roman government. That was their wonderful scheme, not realizing, of course, that in doing that, they were fulfilling what Jesus had predicted, that he would be betrayed, that he would be condemned by the elders of the people, that he would be spat upon and mocked, that he would be handed over to the Gentiles, and that they would crucify him. But what about Judas? It seems Judas didn't expect Jesus to submit himself so far. Some have suggested that maybe Judas thought this would force Jesus' hand. He would not allow himself to be taken in this way. Whatever lie Satan had put into Judas' mind, it didn't turn out the way he expected. And when Judas saw that Jesus was condemned, he was sorry for what he'd done. I have betrayed an innocent man, he says, and decided to go and take the money back, see if he could undo it. Well, of course you can't undo it, especially when you've played into the hands of the powerful men of the regime. So he said, I have betrayed innocent blood. He knew Jesus was innocent. He did not deserve death. But they said, what is that to us? You see to it. You have betrayed him. That's your responsibility. They had urged him to do it, and of course they were responsible as well as Judas. But now that Judas had a change of heart, they would take no responsibility. It was all his fault. So Judas left the money with them and went and hanged himself. The chief priests, what were they going to do with the money? They couldn't just accept it as ordinary money because they knew it was blood money. It was the price of blood. In their scrupulousness, they decided they would buy a field to bury strangers in, a cemetery for foreigners. And so the field has been called the Field of Blood, Akeldama, through the years. That was exactly what Zechariah had prophesied. Matthew tells us, then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Now, an immediate problem strikes us is that those verses actually come from Zechariah, chapter 11, verse 12, not Jeremiah. Now, Zechariah is very much a prophetic passage, predicting both the first and second comings of our Lord Jesus Christ, and his betrayal by the leaders, the false shepherds, as Matthew is reporting. But why does Matthew say Jeremiah? Well, it seems that the traditional ancient order in which the Old Testament books were written in scrolls was such that the prophecy of Zechariah was at the end of the scroll that began with Jeremiah. So to find Zechariah, you went to the scroll of Jeremiah. Jeremiah being the prophet at the time the temple was destroyed, and Zechariah being the prophet at the time it was rebuilt 70 years later, in the early Persian period. The point is that Jesus knew all that was going to happen to him, and he had predicted these things. He knew Judas would betray him. He knew that that was part of the sequence of events that would lead to his execution. And it shows us that we need to be careful in predicting the future and predicting what people will do, because Jesus didn't do what Judas expected when he was framed. Although Judas showed remorse and tried to give back the money and declared Jesus' innocence, he never turned to God asking for forgiveness with his claim, I have sinned against innocent blood. There's no evidence that he is forgiven. He never sought forgiveness of God. He sought to undo what he'd done, but he did not seek his Lord. He had heard, as the others had, that Jesus would die and rise again. He didn't believe that either. He knew the mercy and compassion and grace of Jesus better than most. He had lived with him for 3 years. He had preached in his name. He'd preached Jesus' message to people. He had healed people, he had witnessed all of those things, and yet he had constructed his own interpretation of those events and found that to be false.